So thank you so much to everyone for joining us tonight. My name's Dara Conduit. I'm a postdoc here at the Middle East Studies Forum at Deakin University. And I'll be chairing this panel event tonight alongside my project co-investigator, Dr. Marika Sosnovsky. Marika, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, so nice to be here with you all. Thanks so much for making the time to join us, both the audience and our amazing speakers that we have today. I'm a research fellow currently with the GIGA in Hamburg, based still in Melbourne at the moment, my LAC at the moment. So yeah, we're really looking forward to the event tonight. So thanks for coming, or today.
Thank you, Marika. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which many of us in Australia and other settler colonial states are meeting from today. So I'd like to pay my respects to the Boonwurrung. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm dialing in from the unceded land of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay respects to the elders past and present. I'd also like to reiterate that this land is and will always be sovereign Indigenous land. Before we start this talk tonight, I just want to acknowledge some really, really terrible news that has come out of Lebanon in the last half hour or so. And that is confirmation of the death of Lokman Slim by suspected assassination. Lokman was a high-profile activist and researcher and a prominent critic of Hezbollah. And we'd like to just acknowledge the enormous loss that this represents to Lebanon in a year that has just brought catastrophe after catastrophe. And we'd like to pay respects to his family and also to his many friends who are present in this panel, including our panelists. It's such a huge loss, and we can only hope that those responsible are held to account for this tragedy. Marika and I are really excited tonight to be hosting this event, which is part of a project that's generously funded by the DFAT Council for Australian Relations, in which we aim to take steps to raise the profiles of women's voices of expertise on the politics of the Middle East. And we aim to build connections between Australia and the WoMENA network, which is the preeminent network of female Middle East researchers globally. Tonight, we'll be running this panel, and next week, we'll be running a capacity building workshop for female and non-binary researchers of the Middle East in this country, with masterclasses run by other WoMENA members, and we're so incredibly excited about that. But 2021 is a big year in the Middle East because it marks 10 years since the path-breaking uprisings that took place across the region. These uprisings took place, in so many countries and, involved so many people, but we also know that women have participated in these uprisings and often experience these uprisings and upheavals differently, and also the consequences of them, be they the new political arrangements, wars, or something in between. So tonight, we're really excited to be hosting 3 serious subject matter experts to talk about women 10 years after the uprisings. Our 3 speakers are each on their own rock stars in their field. Most of you will know who they are without me even introducing them. And it's a real privilege to be able to hear from them. So for those of you, and I see many familiar faces in our audience who are return guests, we'll be following a similar format to what we do usually. I've asked each speaker to speak for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then Marika will open the questions, and then we'll be taking questions from you, our audience. So I won't delay this anymore. Our first speaker is Alia Ibrahim, who is the co-founder and CEO of Daraj Media. For those of you, many of you, or most of you will probably know what Daraj Media is, but it's one of the most groundbreaking independent media outfits in the Middle East and a really, really important source. Before Daraj, she was a senior news correspondent for Al Arabiya and has worked across the region. But her career started as a news reporter at the Daily Star in Beirut. She was managing editor of the newspaper in 2014. And she's also one of us. She's a journalism instructor at the Lebanese American University. So Alia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dara, for your introduction. And thank you for your words regarding Lokman. This morning, we've lost a friend to assassination. It's 2 bullets in the head, so it is an assassination. And I think the loss at the personal level and at the national level is beyond words. And I think I mean, this is just another, it's another episode of the reality that we live in. If we, 10 years down the line in Lebanon, it started a little bit earlier, the protests, the revolution, the will to change, this is the reality we have to deal with. And if we look in the general context, I genuinely think very little has, the situation today is getting bleaker. On good days, we tell ourselves it's getting bleaker because we're getting closer to the end. But honestly, in every way we look, it's just too much violence around us. And I'll start from there to go back to the issue we're talking about today. In order to just like put some thoughts and that I would talk about today, I just went back and looked at my coverages of the Arab Spring at the early days, and then my transition to independent media, and I have to say that it was the will on the streets, the protest, this very short-lived idea that the world is going to get better, the nomination of the protest as a spring, it was really the beginning, a very genuine belief that good times are coming to the region that until then was suffering from all kind of dictatorship. When I go back to, in very objective term, when I go back to my coverage, to my footage, I go back and I find women were there all the time. When I go back to my own personal stories, how this coverage changed me as a person and as a journalist. And I look at the countries one by one because of how much I who is an Arab and who thought she knew where she was going, how much the protests per se, even going back to countries I have been before, seeing women in the protests areas, how much it changed my everything. It just made me feel how ignorant I am about everything I thought I knew. In a place like Yemen, for example, I recall how much, and mostly because I was there on a tourist visa and I didn't have a journalist visa, so I was basically covering, when I was on the streets, I was escorted and always with Yemeni women, and later they took me to their offices and they took me to their houses, and I saw how much they were living the revolution. There wasn't a moment of their day when they weren't thinking about it, planning about it, having the vision of what they really want for their country. That was before the narrative changed and the choice became between this or that, two bad choices. There was a genuine will early on to create something better. It was really very simple. It was a better life for everybody who took the streets, a simpler freedom, more justice, before it got too complicated earlier. The accumulation the first year I was covering, I was not there to cover women. I was there to cover protests. I was there to cover the revolution. And a year later, when I was just looking at how to relook at the protests, just from my random footage, I put together a documentary about women on the streets without filming it as such. And it was mostly those women who were standing out who eventually became very well-known figures. They were already very well-known figures in their micro communities, but they were really the leaders. They were emerging as the leaders who took the streets, and they were really inspiring in so many ways. I was able to put a film together without a single additional interview. Their voices were there, the interviews were there. All I had to do is re-edit the whole thing. And it wasn't because I wanted to make a film about women. It was because after a year, all I could, like the most important breakthrough for me was how liberated women became. They went out of their houses, they took the streets, and it changed something forever. And that there was no return, even when things later got really much more complicated. And much more violent. They stayed there. They didn't go back to their houses. They became activists. They played incredible roles at the level of civil societies. I think if they were allowed to really lead the political scene, we would have had much better results than we do today. 10 years later, it's the only place where when one can look and see some really good achievement has been done. In the sense of, if I look now at young journalists and how much they're aware of the power that they have and the responsibility that they have compared to 20 years ago when I started. And I'm talking across the region. It's inspiring to just look how far we've come. I know if we look at the general picture, it's really, really looking bad. Again, one more time, just in December, I was also working on a production wrapping up the 10 years. And I interviewed people from across the region. And the stories that I collected were once more heartbreaking beyond words. When I interview somebody like Lina Atallah in Egypt or MESF, and they tell us about what's happening there in terms of freedom of speech, how things are much worse today than they were 10 years ago. But then the courage of somebody like Lina Atallah or MESF, while being inside Egypt, being capable of saying things exactly as they are. The thing is, the situation now is not worse. It's just that we know more about it. The people, it's true, more people are going to prison, not necessarily but now we hear about it. Now people tell us their stories. Activists work for them to be liberated. People don't die in silence anymore. And I think women played a very, very important role to that. At the level of at the level of cultural acceptance of women's presence in the streets. And again, I'm talking from a very journalistic place. I recall the first time I went to Tunis after the revolution, and I went to Sidi Bouzid, and I met the lady who supposedly started the Arab Spring, the policewoman who supposedly slapped, started the revolution with her famous slap. And then I discovered that she didn't actually slap the guy. So the whole, and her story to me was that she actually was trying to do her job and to forbid a cart from being in the middle of the municipality. But her own story was that the fact that she was an authority, and she would say if it was a man who did the same thing, nothing would have happened. But everything happened because it was a woman who defied a man in the middle of the streets. And the whole thing at the time, I remember I mean, of course it would have been something else, but there was some sense of everything started with a lie regarding a woman who was defying, everything wrong. That was a serious problem, a woman being there and being authority. And we've come really a very long way since then. We have obviously a lot to do. And it's still, again, violence is still, has the highest word, but this is something that we have, that the region has achieved, that women of the region have achieved. And I really think it's worth it to take a moment and not just, I mean, it's very difficult to celebrate, but to see how we can build more on that, how we can better use this to move forward.
Thank you so much, Alia. That's such an interesting way to look at it. You know, there's been so much hardship, but also so much has been gained along the way. So thank you for sharing your thoughts, and I look forward, I'm sure the audience has about 50 questions for you, so I look forward to digging into that a little bit further after our speakers have finished. Our second speaker tonight is Asma Khalifa, who is a Libyan activist and researcher who has worked on human rights, women's rights, and youth empowerment since 2011. In 2016, she won the Luxembourg Peace Prize, and in 2017 at the World Peace Forum, she was named one of the most influential one of the 100 most influential young Africans. She's also co-founder of Tamazight, sorry if I've mispronounced that, women's movement, which is a think/do tank that's working on gender equality and research on the Indigenous women of Libya and North Africa. And we're so incredibly lucky to have Asma with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Dara. And you did almost pronounce it correctly. It's Tamazight. Good morning and good evening to all, and my condolences to my colleagues in Lebanon for the terrible news. When I think about 2011, I still feel a bit, with all that has happened, I still feel a sense of awe about how Libyan women took part. And that's given the context that we come from, how Gaddafi has politicized, well, not politicized, but how Gaddafi has stigmatized women in politics, because he created these revolutionary nuns and several other quite fantastical ideas of his to feminize the military, etc. And that push towards women empowerment in his policy has made Libyans even more conservative, of course, with the tide of religious conservatism also coming from Saudi Arabia, etc., in the region in the 90s. But so women occupying public space or taking any of the leadership position was incredibly difficult. And so in 2011, when there was this opportunity and space to have it, for me, it still is quite inspiring to think about all the roles women try to fill, to take a part. And of course, back then, naively, we had thought that the revolution has equalized. I think that was also a thing in the whole of protests in the region when women took space, and then that we thought that men understood why it was important for us to be there. And we realized not even years later, like a few months later, in the liberation speech of Tripoli, that it was used, women's presence was used to portray revolutions or uprisings or the opposition as a more free, as a better liberal, more free thinking than the dictatorships before them. And I think that's what characterizes the past 10 years is this push and resistance, where women are not going back to any scenario prior to 2011, and at the same time, men are having the high hand in terms of power, because of course, like the conflict in Libya or Yemen, it's very, very gendered. It's men who have the military power and capabilities. It's men who have the economic power, and it's men who have the political power. So so women, I see it maneuver to try to take any other space that's not still taking, and that's why they took leadership in forming civil society organizations. They took leadership in supporting the democratic transition in 2012, for instance, and the elections. And they've pushed for quotas, they've pushed for women to take more position. But it's hard when you have zero experience. I mean, in unlike others in the region, in 2011, we did not have civil society organizations. Basically, civil society organizations sprang from the needs of a humanitarian response in an environment of a civil war. So it was already quite a harsh place to be. There was very little training. Still is. There was very little training, very little knowledge about how this work is being done. There's been quite a lot of violence, and in 2014 already we entered a second phase of a civil war, which has assassinated over 12 female activists and politicians between 2014 and 2015. It has not even, unfortunately, stopped. Even just last December, the lawyer from Benghazi a female lawyer from Benghazi was assassinated in broad daylight in the streets because she was trying to expose corruption from Haftar's family's son or the establishment. So it's the space continued to shrink. I mean, over the years, but what I see, and as Alia has beautifully said, there's so much resistance Even with the picture being extremely bleak, there's so much resistance to continue to do the work, to continue to keep the values of 2011 alive, and that is a stubbornness to build the country, even though it's riddled with so much conflict and despair. And I see that in so many other places where, in the region as well, where there is, very little that would encourage you to do this work, but the people are not giving up, because sense of agency and power that I think all of us have felt in 2011 is still somewhere there. I mean, it's in many cases it's been diminished or sometimes crushed, but it's not gone completely. That, I mean, and Alia said that it's in Lebanon, protests has not stopped. In Iraq, protest has not stopped. I don't see 2011 as an isolated event that just happened once. I see it has started something that will continue to happen for the years to come until the change actually occur. And change is not a 6 months, 8 months protest movement to remove a regime. Change is an accumulative action of millions of people who want to do structural change, to improve their life conditions, whether it's a democracy or anything else, really. So, and you can't do that without half the population also wanting to do it. There is no sustainable peace without women being at the center also of the picture and leading the narrative. So it's what I see is that there is so much yet to be done 10 years after 2011. And I think that I think it probably would feel much harder now because there's so much destruction to build from. But there is no way of moving but forward. There is no going back to before 2011. There is nothing alive before 2011 to go back to for many of us in the countries. And that we need to remember that as movements, we have to accept the fact that sometimes change might not occur in our lifetime. And that's why we need to adopt and embrace new movements. All these young people who come up in protests last year and in 2019 and in 2018 across the region are all very young people who were extremely young in 2011, who should be included in the movement of 2011. There is space and value for everyone of every age and every position. And I think in order for movements to survive, they need to do that. We need to build from each other's experience and learn from each other to be able to do better, and not think of events as standalone. I think that's from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asma, and thank you for sharing your experiences of being involved in those protests in the early days. And I think for illustrating so clearly to us just how, even though sometimes it seems bleak, 2011 really did fundamentally change things. Women have suffered enormously. They've had their participation appropriated, but they've continued to stand up and to innovate and to continue to push Libya forward, which is a phenomenal thing and a phenomenal change. So thank you for being such a key part of that. Last but not least, we have Lama Fakih, who will speak. Lama is Human Rights Watch's Crisis and Conflict Director, and she's also the director of the Beirut office. She was previously a senior crisis advisor at Amnesty International and was Human Rights Watch's Syria and Lebanon researcher between 2011 and 2015. So, it is no stretch to say that she absolutely is a subject matter expert on this. Lama has also worked as a Gender, Human Rights and Counterterrorism Fellow at the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at the New York University School of Law. Lama, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dara. Thank you to my colleagues for your really insightful remarks. I want to speak to the Syrian experience, but before getting into that, maybe we'll just offer some general reflections based on the work that I've done in the region over the past 10 years. And working on uprisings, political movements, and wars that have developed in North Africa, but also in Yemen and in the Levant in Iraq. One of the clear things that has come to stand out for me is that the movements that have relied on external power forces have really faltered. The looking outward for support and sustenance in overthrowing a government and establishing an alternative to dictatorship was something that we saw repeatedly fail. And for movements that were able to rely on domestic structures, local syndicates, student unions, these were the movements that had a stronger backbone that enabled them to develop and offer an alternative. And I think it is an important lesson for us to reflect on in thinking about the current, political uprisings and movements that we are experiencing and how to strengthen them. In the Syrian experience, we saw as Alia and as Asma have said, in the context of Libya and more broadly, that women were on the streets joining men and kids in calling for the downfall of regime, calling for their basic rights. They really played a myriad number of roles in the early days of the uprising and through the conflict. Political activists, humanitarians, first responders, survivors of indiscriminate attacks, victims, but also breadwinners, detained, displaced, refugees, and even terrorists. And their active involvement was really not about women's rights per se, but about fighting for themselves, their families, their communities, and against a way of governance that was antithetical to their basic rights. And when that government responded with repression, we saw that women did bear the weight of that repression, and that they continue to do so today. In the 10 years since the conflict began, we have seen many, many reports written about the abuses that women and girls have suffered in the context of the conflict. I've offered some of these at Human Rights Watch, as have other colleagues, and they cover things from the detention of mothers and wives whose male relatives were wanted by the authorities, rape and sexual violence of women and girls in their homes with impunity simply because security forces could. Really the tragic results of indiscriminate attacks that were targeted against civilians that slaughtered in some cases entire families, targeted executions that resulted in mass graves that have never been unearthed, that have never been investigated, cases of exploitation and enslavement, suffering, discrimination by extremist groups, death by chemicals, the forced displacement, disappearance, and now in large swaths of Syria, what is crippling poverty, and in some cases loss of shelter, deprivation of most basic rights. We, in all cases, wrote these reports with the hope of showing what was often invisible suffering, and as well as invisible contributions of women and girls in the conflict. And with the hope that these experiences would be taken into consideration during political debates and when development commitments were being considered. It has always been, our understanding, as Asma put it, that women needed to be active participants in any future that was going to be rights respecting in Syria. And so it was important to understand the roles that women were playing in the situations that they were suffering through. And the tragedy of that experience and the injustice of that experience is one that really pervades the current situation. And I think one we need to really reckon with in order to understand, where we can go from here. I want to highlight sort of two scenarios, because I think they are instructive for some of the challenges that we are facing in Syria in the next phase. The first is the situation for women and children that are being held in northeast Syria. Nearly 2 years ago, local fighters aided by the US-led anti-ISIS coalition stormed the town of Daraj and captured the remaining ISIS fighters there, as well as women and children that were residing there. And these individuals, were from over 60 countries, but also many of them were Syrians and as well as Iraqis. And since then, for over 2 years, nearly 2 years now, they have been detained in camps in northeast Syria in really very desperate humanitarian conditions. They have not been charged with any crime, and they have not been afforded any opportunity to come before a judge. They are merely held in many of these cases simply by virtue of being a relative of a suspicious individual. And if we look at, so this is sort of the situation in northeast Syria under the control of Kurdish authorities there. If we look at it as well, coupled with the situation under the Assad government, where we continue to have thousands detained for political reasons. And we've seen that women activists, in many cases, calling for the release of their male relatives, have been very influential in trying to advance detainee rights globally. And this activism, is represented in movements like Families for Freedom, but there are many of these, and they are really trying to, push for Syria's detained to disappear to be released, for the locations of mass graves to be identified, and also for there to be justice for victims. And I think that these strands of advocacy really reflect the sort of open wounds and the ongoing abuses that we're dealing with in the Syrian context. These are the types of abuses, the crux of which we're really going to have to entangle and remedy in order to really allow sort of the hope of the Arab Spring to come to fruition. It is true that as a result of these uprisings, a veil was lifted over what appeared to be stability, what appeared to be progress, and we are sort of seeing the festering wound that is under it. But in the process of this uprising, there are a lot of people who have lost everything. And the remedy really requires that we address these wounds in order to be able to build from here. And there has been, unfortunately, other countries have moved on. And I think it is a really question for, on the domestic level, how can we support local initiatives that are going to pull people up, that will be able to, really begin to develop alternatives to the dictatorships that still stand. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lama, for highlighting the very real challenges that continue to be faced by women in Syria, but also the incredible ways that some of these women have pushed back through groups like Families for Freedom, which have just undertaken such amazing work. And I think, it is a challenge for all of us to work out how to support these phenomenal grassroots groups that are just having such an enormous impact on people's lives. I'm going to invite Marika now to start our question and answer session. She's going to ask a couple of questions of our panelists just to set the scene, and then we'll open up the floor soon after so that the rest of you can ask your questions. I'm sure you have many.
I also wanted to start by thanking you all for these really interesting talks. And I really love, despite the kind of sad tales in there, I love that you all, kind of three of you, emphasized this radical resistance and the stubbornness of women amidst this whole story of the uprisings. And I think that's really important. And I think you three embody that very much. And I sort of wanted to start with you, Lama, because perhaps you have a broad insight as to what's been going on across the Middle East because of your role with Human Rights Watch. And I wonder, I mean, you talked about those local grassroots institutions, and I wondered, like, what have you seen in your role there at Human Rights Watch as the kind of structural barriers towards putting women's voices as a way to create some sort of policy change? If we put women leaders and women's voices more up front, we can expect a different kind of story to happen. And I just wondered if you can talk a little bit more about the structural barriers that are in place around that at the moment.
Thanks, Marika, for your very good question. I think we do need to acknowledge that in all of these countries that we're talking about, women continue to face real discrimination under the law. And that this discrimination has disfavored their ability to act equally in public life. And this is from discrimination within personal status laws to unequal access to education. I mean, these are real structural barriers to women being able to participate equally in government. I mean, even if we take Lebanon as an example, the paltry representation of women in politics is in some way a superficial but very clear example of even in a country where women are highly educated, where women play a big role in civil society organizations, that is not being transferred into the public sphere. And there is real discrimination and stereotyping that continues to persist. And so these types of structural barriers are ones that women are fighting while they are also fighting these establishments of oppression that male counterparts are also facing. So not only are you disadvantaged in these ways, but also you are met by a repressive government that is willing to do whatever it needs to do to ensure that it remains in power. So it's a combination, I think, of this, the real threat of empowered dictatorship plus these underlying societal, laws, but also attitudes that discriminate against women.
Yeah, thanks, Lama. I think that's right. Those kind of structural, those legal regimes that are in place, I mean, not just in the Middle East, of course, but everywhere, and all those structural barriers, we face them everywhere as women. I wanted to sort of also, Asma, I was going to ask you, because it kind of flows on from what Lama was saying about these legal regimes, because I know you do a lot of work around minority rights in the Middle East. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about why it's so important that we have the voices of Middle East minorities on the table, when we're talking about a way forward or, creating some sort of better future.
Thanks, Marika. Well, the Amazigh and the Tabuna Tuareg in Libya came out in 2011 primarily because of the suppression of Gaddafi's regime. What Arab dictatorships do in the region is they center their control around this constructed Arab Muslim identity that you cannot exist outside of it. Yeah, you do not. I mean, Gaddafi outright erased us from all history books. He even funded research institutions and research projects that said we don't exist because we are a threat. So linguistic minorities and indigenous groups are seen as a threat to national security. They're seen as a threat to this identity that has to be controlled by the dictatorships. So to come out against that and to try to change that legally and socially is to actually finally embrace the diversity the region has. It's to have all people's experiences visible and contributing to rebuilding the new, because if we continue to suppress linguistic minorities and indigenous groups, then we did not move far from before 2011. We don't do better, and the grievances will still continue because the issues are also connected to land ownership. In the case of Libya, the issues are connected to the redistribution of wealth. And of course, they are centered around also the conflict of identity that we have broadly also in the region. This having 40 or 30 or whatever many years, someone telling you that this is only the identity you're allowed to have, and this is the identity that nothing else exists. A lot of people in the region have difficulties if they're not born indigenous or linguistic minority. They have difficulties understanding the experiences that linguistic or linguistic minorities or indigenous people have, because of course you've grown up in a complete reality that was, you know, predominantly Arab, predominantly Muslim, and then after 2011 all these sorts of groups are coming out and saying, well, no, we're not that. And I see that in part as the conflict in Libya, especially amongst in the south of Libya, where we had a lot of ethnic conflicts over the years of groups fighting in Kufran and in other places. So it's if that does not change, as I said, the grievances will not go, and that means we haven't moved far.
Yeah, thanks, Asma. I think that's celebrating the diversity that's inherent in the Middle East, because it's not always apparent to people. I mean, we had ourselves a discussion before when we were organising this panel about calling it the Arab Uprisings, of course, which you nicely corrected us on. So I think it's, you know, increasingly important that we acknowledge the diversity in the region, which is hopefully part of, you know, the good change that we've seen, people kind of throwing off that rigid identity of only one Muslim Arab identity, I think. Which leads me to the next question for Alia, which, you know, when you started Daraj, I read that you called it this third story, and I wondered, maybe people sort of in the audience don't know, maybe they do, maybe they don't, about Daraj, and I wondered if you could explain a little bit more about this sort of idea that you had about Daraj being a third story and a third way for sort of reporting on the Middle East.
As I mentioned earlier, Daraj was created out of frustration and out of belief that mainstream media, which I was part of for the longest time, was actually contributing to the problem and setting of the narratives as they became known. The choices that were given to people is you're choosing between two polarized, equally violent choices, basically. It was either Assad or Daesh. It was either radical Islam or dictatorship. Across the board, what we were suggesting is the third story that is funded by neither Saudi or Iran. It's the third story that is independently. This is where the slogan came from. And throughout the years, we're on our third year here. And I want to tell you, our main focus was basically on giving a lot of space to underreported issues, and to touch on the issue of women here. Gender is one area that we extensively cover in Daraj. Not gender, it includes also gender minorities that we cover really well. And I think this is something that's important to look at, something Lama touched on also while she was speaking. This idea that when you're a woman and you're out there fighting, you are fighting for what everybody else is, but you're also fighting your own personal fight against. And this is also sometimes you feel this is a waste of your energy, because some people with the best intentions feel they have something to lose because of your fight. The patriarchy is so well rooted, and to many of the women activists, the fight was inside their homes, where their own moms and their own families and their own, and I'm talking here about well-educated liberal people. So crossing that point and saying no to the system, this is something we've seen intensively in Lebanon, especially since last October, when like a loud voice on the street, the revolution was called, the revolution is female, it's a Sawra Unsa. And it was not just a slogan, it was really because for many women who took the street, this was fighting for custody over their children, having their like basic rights, something you would not even be discussing in a country that is pretending to be liberal like Lebanon. So for us at Daraj, we made it a point to call on female voices to contribute as writers, on topics that are very much underreported. I have to say, at the beginning, the getting started was very difficult, despite all our like going after female voices. We barely reached 28% of our writers, despite the fact that 75% of our readership is female. So it's a media that is started by a large number of women, and we were not able of attracting, especially from some countries. Now and I'll tell you some, we get submissions, for example, from young journalists. The amount of submissions we get from men is still like 5 times more. And it comes with much more confidence in the content itself than when we receive something coming from women, despite the fact that we tell young female writers, we will help you at the beginning, at least to get the sense of how you write an article as opposed to a status on social media. This is to say that we're seeing some change here, but again, what we have to deal with is so well rooted in so many ways, at so many levels, and you're trying to change everything at the same time. This is gonna, like, I think it's too naive to think we're going to see change in 10 years, even in one generation. It's gonna take time. It's gonna take a whole generation of families raising their daughters to think differently, not to have to be at the conflict with everything they're facing. Focus on, and I think it's happening, but again, we have to know that this is something that's going to take a much longer time. When we see how the small change, I think Daraj for us became a more concise space to look at change. We can see the little progress, how things are progressing in different places. And we see change, not as fast as you would love to, because we want to get over with this nightmare, really. We're sick and tired of all these news that we're still getting every day. If you look at the last 48 hours, there is always a woman who has been killed here and a political persona who was assassinated there. We wake up and we sleep listening to this kind of stories. And it would be really good to think that in this region, we will get to the point when we don't have to deal with this kind of news, targeted violence, basically.
Certainly, I think you've answered that so well, because I mean, I had a sort of follow-up question on kind of the structural barriers similar to Lama that are facing women's voices in the media. And I think you explained that really well in terms of the amount of authors you were getting that were female, and then the amount of readership that you had, and how Daraj, it's a long kind of scale problem, and how the small steps you guys are taking to kind of overcome that, I think, is really important. I'm going to open up now to questions from the audience. Dara is going to help me in that moderation, because she has many more skills at that than I do. We will, in the spirit of the event, of course, take our first question from a woman, and I open it up to the floor, our great audience out there.
So if you could all, when you'd like to speak, just raise your hand. I think you click on the participants tab. I can't quite see how this works. Hadil has worked out how to do it. That's good. But somewhere in there, maybe on more or something like that, you can choose to raise a hand. We actually had a question in the comments. If we're happy to start with that, Marika, does that work from you? From Heba, do you want to ask your question out loud?
Hi, thanks so much, Dara. This is a question to the panel. I was just wondering, how effective or influential have the international community or the various policy agendas, for example, like the Women in Peace and Security agenda, how has that helped with women's participation in your in the local conflicts.
Who is the question for?
Sorry, it's for the panel. So it's for whoever wants to answer it.
I think we will all have an answer to this. Very quickly, I think there are 2 points. I think international exposure and networking has been very good for many of the women who are working in that sphere. But on the other hand, I really think, and I think it's genuine, that the narrative that it's very important to keep saying that women's right is not some value we have imported from the West. It's very important to, because this is one of the first things that is said, women's right, LGBT rights, all these things, these are not our values. This is not our culture. And this is why I think the good thing that has happened lately, very recently, is owning the voice when claiming these rights, localizing these needs as very authentic and very real needs. In as much as we have to build on what has been accomplished at the level internationally in terms of both laws and structures, but I think it's very important how locally this has become part of the rhetoric.
I can go next if that's okay. I think from my experience working on the Women, Peace and Security agenda and in various programs, what I see is that there's been quite attempts to try to support women's groups and to support female activists, to try to do advocacy on the international level, whether it's at the Security Council and elsewhere. But then these same states who, give this support almost as if it's like an automatic thing on their annual budget, at the same time take policies that are completely contradictory to the Women, Peace and Security agenda, that they would support, status quo, they would support militias, they would support the conflict in a ways that would allow it would continue to not have women on the table. In fact, I found that, and I've stopped doing that now, but a few years ago, I found that I would give my time, in fact, to advocate for international mechanisms to do their job, because the UN would design a process where it completely excludes women because they want to culturally appropriate, for instance. And I would find myself, giving energy to tell them to do their mandate, their own mandate. So it's a complicated issue. I think a lot of many governments would do it because they've agreed to do it and they have a national action plan, and sometimes their own civil society supports women's organizations. And that's good. I like the solidarity part. I like the learning part from other international, other NGOs from other countries. But when it comes on a state level, there is still not really a true belief or even a true consideration that this mechanism would work, because they do everything that would undermine it.
Oops, did you want to respond as well, Lama?
I can just add briefly. I mean, I really, what Asma has said really resonates for me as well. I think the mechanisms are important. I think they're necessary, but they're certainly not sufficient, and they aren't adequately prioritized. And so I think there's a little bit of, giving with one hand and taking with the other, as Asma has outlined. And I think we can use these mechanisms as tools, but we cannot always count on the originators to live up to our expectations.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I saw a report out recently too, talking about how, so much of the Women, Peace and Security agenda has been dominated by Western institutions and Western women as well, which has been counterproductive in so many ways to what the agenda has been about. We've got a question now from Hadil, who is one of our, who is working with us on this project. Hadil, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, can you hear me? All right. First of all, thank you so much for the panelists for providing such informative panel about what has been going on in Middle Eastern and in MENA countries in regard of women's participation in the uprising. I can tell that according to 3 of the panelists, that women are fighting against multi-layered patriarchal society and systems. It started from the family, the way that they are raised, the layer of the tribe, the layer of a patriarchal system, the layer of being from a linguistic and indigenous background. So they are not only fighting against a conflict within the state society relation, if I would say. No, they are fighting against so many suppression and discrimination climate and circumstances that suppressed any type of even showing their identity, of sharing their own ideas, of just saying that we can even have the right to be visible in public spaces. I've got 2 questions actually. One of them is to Alia. Being a journalist, you have mentioned something really important, saying that the change that you have from your own perspective that you have seen is that there's not really much change happened on the street. The only change that you see is that these violations are now known by the public. From your perspective as a journalist, you are covering such a news, you are disclosing so many horrible stories about women who have been part of these uprising and how they have been demoralized, for example, they have been abducted, they have been threatened. So from your own perspective, what do you think the role of journalism should be to support such women? Is it only just to cover their stories, to highlight what they have been through, or do you think that journalism should do more than covering these stories, having in mind that women journalists themselves are discriminated against, specifically in war zone places? My second question is to Asma. She mentioned that, which is also a very important point, that the change that happened in the Libyan society, if we're talking also about empowering, politically empowering women, Libyan women, is that they don't have such experience in the political field. So what do you think, how can they have such experience? How can they be provided by such experience if they come, if they try to? Whom do you think they can help them in this regard? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hadil. I think what I meant when I was mentioning the violence that was taking place, I think what I was referring to taking political prisoners and all kind of violence that in the past was part of the reality of the life, but it was a part that was neutralized. It was a part that was accepted up until 2011, and now and since then, less and less. Now, at least, yes, there is a huge amount of violence being done both at the level of the state and at the level of the society. But now we started seeing when something happens, the activism that takes place in talking about it, in making campaigns about it, is putting actual pressure. We're seeing that across the region. We're seeing that the system now has, the establishments has now to find the resisting the change, obviously, because this is a big loss to them, but at least there is pressure that is being put. People are not dying in silence. Women are not being, the idea of even the whole debate around, for example, honor killing. now 10 years ago, this was almost a fait accompli. It was like, this is the culture, and just accept it and move on. Right now, this is not the case. This is not diminished the violence. The violence is still, and sometimes it's even increasing, because the spaces where the women are themselves going out is putting them in a situation where they're attacked even more. So if you look at the numbers that we're getting to see, maybe they are more dramatic, and we're seeing more violence. But what I meant is, it doesn't just pass now. It doesn't. We don't normalize it. We don't neutralize that as something that we have to accept because this is the culture, or this is the religion, or this is what some of the demonstrations that went out in Beirut were extremely clear in attacking whoever, the religion or the law, that is taking away from their rights. We did not see that possible 10 years ago. About the role of journalism, and though we in Daraj are very keen to make sure that what we do is journalism, but in the issue of women's right, and as is the case of all minorities that are, like in the case of refugees as well, we still label opinion as opinion and report as report, but this is a space where we allow ourselves to get a little bit outside our mandate in journalism, and we allow a little bit more of activism. We do label it as activism when we do, but these are spaces you cannot be neutral, even in your journalism. The idea about journalism, why it's there, is to hold the powerful accountable, and to actually give a voice to the underrepresented. So in these cases, we are a little bit on the subject, not a little bit, we're actually very much on taking the sides of be it the women, and again, any underreported, marginalized group. And we put that in editorials, and we put that in the content that we present. Obviously, again, we present everything in its category, but we're very proud to actually be supportive of such. This is why we were there to begin with. This is partly, these were completely underreported topics. When I worked in Arabia before, it was easier to cross the lines of politics and go between the red lines and try to avoid censorship. Talking about women's issues was much more difficult, for example.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for your question, Hadil. I think experience is earned by practice, and Libyan women are doing that. I think on a more local level than national, because they haven't had elections since 2014. So we had programs with Tamazight Women Movement, actually, where we supported female municipal members in local politics, and how they could set agendas, and how they could have policies that are more gender aware. And it was mostly in the Fusa mountain, and so it's a dominant Amazigh villages and towns. But it was an experience to see how women actually have, and it was a learning experience for me as well, although I delivered the training, because I've learned about the dynamics that they've gone through. So we try to tailor it exactly how they needed it, and that's like how they could ambush men meetings that happen in the middle of the night over tea, instead of at the municipality. I've also learned that mostly women in working in municipalities are also in charge and head of crisis committees that work on the humanitarian intervention. So actually they work extra harder than anyone else, but they don't take the decisions, because, as I said, these are male exclusive spaces that are done at ungodly hours, where women, there is no way for them to do it. So it was quite an interesting experience to learn. And we had now still in the last couple of months, we've been having elections on local level, and there's been quite a lot of female participation. In Tripoli now, they're having municipal elections, and I know of a few young female women who are electing themselves. So I think it's by practice. It will take time to change this culture, but the more we put out there, the more we have support for each other and solidarity, one day we will manage.
Thank you so much. Our next question is from Sharam. If you can unmute yourself.
Okay, well, thanks to the panel. Really inspiring presentations. I do have a question that's been kind of going around my head in relation to women's rights in Iran, but I think there's obvious parallels and similarities with the rest of the Middle East. You talked about institutional limitations and barriers to women. You talked about need for legal change. But you also talked about social challenges, social issues. The very last example of holding meetings at a time where women cannot participate is just one example. So my question is, where do you focus your energy? What is best in terms of where is the balance? Do we need to achieve social change, cultural change, before we get to institutional change and legal change, or vice versa? Where should the focus be? The curveball, as they say.
I can give some just initial thoughts. I think the institutional sources of oppression and societal, cultural ones are really mutually reinforcing. And sometimes you need to work on parallel tracks. And I'll give the example of the sexual harassment law in Lebanon that was recently passed and landed in a context where, a lot of people don't understand the need for a sexual harassment law. And really, what is sexual harassment other than like women like overreacting about innocent comments or really reaction of men to women's sexuality. I think the fact of the law is something that can create a shift in societal understanding of what like sexual harassment is. And when they see consequences to actions that they may not otherwise deem as inappropriate, it can begin this process of cultural shift. But it's not something that you can expect because you've changed your law, but suddenly society is going to fall in line. I mean, you really do need to be pushing forward on all of these tracks, which is of course not without its challenges. But I think a real essential part of impactful reform.
Can I quickly follow up on that if there's no other comment? So achieving impactful reform and change, does that mean that you would need allies, and what kind of allies would you need to push for that kind of impactful change, impactful reform?
Definitely. I mean, I think across the board, you're going to need people with power to support these shifts, but also broad-based buy-in for them. And it depending on the issue, it really depends, who your allies are, who the most strategic allies are. And it will depend as well on the country context and the time at which the reforms are moving ahead. But a lot of work, for example, is being done in Lebanon, looking at how outreach can be done with men about violence in the home, to shift their understanding of how to respond to conflict within the home, what is appropriate, how to manage their own emotions. It's not always the women that need to be doing the work. And as well, I mean, we talked a little bit about sort of international cooperation and the ways in which the international community can be involved to support domestic women's rights movements, which again, there is a balance here between this myth of sort of importing women's rights as an external value, while also, funding civil society organizations that wouldn't otherwise be able to raise that money domestically. So I think we need to be strategic about alliances, but they're certainly critical.
We've got a bit of a kind of want to turn Sharam's question around. Asma, you mentioned a couple of times in terms of focusing where you choose to focus your energy. And I think that's really important. You know, we've all mentioned these kind of really structural problems that we face at numerous levels. And I wondered if you can talk about, Asma can start, and maybe Lama and Alia have some thoughts as well about how you sort of ration your energy and where you prioritize it as a person, I guess, in terms of these things that we're facing.
Thank you, Marika. I think it was really hardly learned over the years, because when there is a civil war, everything is a crisis, everything is important, and everything, you need to work on everything, and you get stretched so thin, and people drop out because of the security situation. And the more there are assassinations, the more there's reluctance for people to take, you know, to take risks, understandably. And what we couldn't do as an organization, as Tamazight Women Movement, for instance, is we couldn't actually have strategies that are long-term. We started with 1 year, and then sometimes we have 2-year strategy, but there's always something that would come up, and then we need to shift our focus into working on it. And remaining flexible has always been important, and finding entry points where I could push towards something is also extremely important. So even if I have a strategy that, let's say this year I'm going to focus on documenting sexual violence in conflict, I will never admittedly say that I do that, but let's say hypothetically that I am doing that. But if there is an entry point where, for instance, we will have a communication channel with someone in the government to push for this, then we would focus our energy on that. If there is an entry point where we can, you know, produce a good report, and then we will focus our energy on that. It's a bit not as organized as we would like to be, but as I said, again, in I'll give an example for that. From 2018 onwards, we were already having plans of how we can do more networking, and how we can across the country, and how we can, as civil society, try to reunite efforts even though the country is divided. And then we were doing so well with that, and then 2019 happened, and Haftar attacked Tripoli, and then suddenly our network was having issues being united again, and we had to focus our effort in, you know, pulling ourselves together instead of moving forwards with our plans. So it's constantly, I always say that working in the middle of a civil war is like trying to build a house that is constantly being bombarded, because you never finish the structure because you are being pulled elsewhere in different directions. But finding entry points is extremely important.
I think I can build exactly on what Asma is saying, and if there is a key word for everything that would be done, it would be strategy, strategy, strategy. What we've been lacking year in, year out is, despite all this amazing talent and amazing energy and amazing wills, it always remained individualistic, and by individualistic I mean even when it's organizational, it's very much at the level of a specific organization or a small network of organizations. And this means practically that everybody is doing work that in a lot of cases is overlapping, because we're all stressing on what is the emergency right now. And while if you think strategically at this amount of resources, and here mostly I talk about human resources and knowledge, if the energy was well thought of before, and in terms of, it's actually, most people don't even have 1 year and 2 year strategies. But imagine if we've had a 5-year strategy, whereas a larger amount of stakeholders are taking the time, giving the time, even because we live in a space where all the time there's going to be crisis. So there should be like this strategy that is not stopped by whatever is happening. But it's a pity to see all all that, because, you know, it's like always a chapter of good stories that could, you feel that this is getting somewhere, and then it just disappears. And to go back to Sharam's question, they cannot be mutually exclusive. This injustice that is happening at the heart of all these societies. This is part of why we needed change to begin with. So it's really a very organic part of the bigger fight, and fighting for it should be fought at all the levels and everybody does their job. The problem is that everybody's doing their job at a very, very micro level, whereas they speak the same language, have the same values, want to go to the same place, it's the same vision and mission and everything, only everybody's working in their very small microzones, in their very small society. What we lack is this, again, this is starting to happen, but it's still very, very immature, very young, very much based on the goodwill of those who are trying to do it. And let's not forget the ecosystems we're working against are very well rooted, and they've been there forever, unrooting what they have built. And we don't have any structure to build on. We don't have political parties in most of these countries. We don't have anything to reform to begin with. You need to unroot everything and then start from scratch. And unless you have a strategy to do that in the medium and long term, I see like mushrooming initiatives that keep us alive, but that will not in the long term take us where we want to go if we don't start thinking about it in a more long term way.
Did you want to add to that, Lama?
Yeah, I'll just briefly add, I concur with a lot of what's been said, and I won't repeat it, but just a couple additional points. I mean, as representing an international organization, when we develop our strategy, we do so trying, you know, with intentionality and being mindful as well about what local partners are doing. And being mindful of how, when we talk about an issue, how it will be received. And so I think that is important, really, to think about your positioning and where you're entering the debate and the perception of the work that you're going to be doing in terms of the type of impact that you'll have. I also just want to comment on the psychological impact of doing this work and the choice around that. I think as human rights advocates, even for those of us that are outside of the immediate danger zone, you know, or outside of the threat of arrest or, you know, seizure or, you know, shelling, that there are psychological risks to doing this work, and that we need to be mindful of those and the resources that are available, the techniques that you can use to meet some of those challenges, and do work that you fundamentally believe that you can have an impact on, that is meaningful for you, but that also is sustainable for you. And I think, you know, we all experience in our work colleagues who have lost so much as a result of the contributions that they've given to this work. And some of that burnout is avoidable. And to keep people in the game for the long run, you know, to really keep them in this fight, it is going to be important, I think, for us to really mainstream knowledge about the risks and the type of resources and the techniques that are available.
I think that's such an important point. And I mean, it's a conversation that comes up so often within the Women Know MENA network too, isn't it? About how to look after oneself when doing such important work, and how to protect from the enormous damage that it can cause personally. Our next question was from Riyadh. If you could unmute yourself.
Unmute myself. Yes, thank you very much for that. I think Shahram raised a very important question and a follow-up to it. I just want to give an anecdotal kind of experience myself. Like back in October 2019, in the uprising in Baghdad at the Tahrir Square, I happened to be in Baghdad at that time. And on the first day, I decided to go. I mean, I wasn't there for the demonstrations. I had something else to do. But I decided to go and to see what's going on in Tahrir Square. It was incredible in terms of the level of female level of participation in all kinds of activities, young and old, different support roles, support roles, leading roles, talking to the media, and so on. The second time I went there, my niece took me. She wanted to show me that what she and her friends were doing. And I should say here that my niece is part of a very conservative family. I mean, if she goes out, she would have to be asked, lots of questions about her whereabouts, and it's a very conservative family. But it gave me the impression that in an environment of societal, family restrictions, I think the barriers would dissolve eventually in an atmosphere of social justice and political change environment. And that's what my experience from this little experience that I had in Baghdad. It was really liberating, in my view, to a lot of women in Iraq. That's just a comment.
Thank you, Riyad. I mean, they were truly remarkable protests. Hadil spoke about them powerfully last year at an event that we hosted. Our next question is from Amar. If you could unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me, and you guys have been incredible to listen to, really inspiring. So this is like a question for Alia and Lama. Reading some of the female narratives that have come out of the Lebanese revolution, by which women have said they've never really went out before, or don't usually go out, and have really internally struggled due to the civil war. Looking at the community level, since the revolution, where we've seen people from all religious, socioeconomic backgrounds and so on come together, has there been any positive consequences or improvements for women in regards in culture, attitudes, or even deconstructing taboos that may have the potential to have longevity?
From where we're standing, Amar, and I'll use the word taboos that you mentioned, even before the demonstrations, when we started in 2017 in Daraj, one of the things that we did was to approach issues that are considered taboos at the level of the general context, like virginity, like stuff like that are usually not spoken about in the media. What we discovered is that the content itself got a lot of attention, and it did not create the backlash that we thought it would. If your tone is not very provocative, if you're talking about issues that are very important to women, even from a very personal side, how you approach taboos, we've discovered, and we've built mileage on that. How you've covered taboos, it's become, the conversation has become possible to be had. At the legal level, and I'll speak very briefly what happened since October 19, and what I mentioned earlier about specific women going out on the street talking exactly in very plain and open cases about what has been happening to them. One of our colleagues who's been a journalist for the longest time, Badia Fahas, went inside a demonstration and she was holding a banner on which she wrote, "I want to see my children." And Badia is a mother who has not seen her children for years because she lost custody. It picked up and more women started joining Badia. And then at the beginning of the protests, we had a number of talks in downtown Beirut where other women came and started saying that how they lost their children because of the law. And it is picking up. The laws change? No, they have not. But what we're seeing now is more women breaking, like giving up on trying to find small solutions for their problems through like trying to negotiate a better deal at the personal level, and just going out and saying, change the law. We want a civil code to run our personal affairs. And this is really building up. And I really think this is one of the fights that will will get somewhere. Speaking about institutional, this is why we need more people in parliament who would move such laws much faster than they would, because until now it's really, even people who pretend to be liberal inside parliament, it's really big blocs who don't want to see this change, because at the end of the day, this is also politics. Even this having all our laws being dictated by the religious courts. This is a way to keep control of the society as it is. So yes, we are seeing change in that, and at the level of the streets, absolutely. I mean, this is really has become one of the most spoken about changes. And actually, very quickly, I will follow up on what Riyad was saying earlier. In Iraq, this was also very noticeable at the level of the women participation, and even women coming from very conservative backgrounds started saying, well, we want our rights and we want to be able to live normally as women, and without compromising on our basic rights. We've seen it everywhere, and it's become part of the slogans from within the demonstrations, I think.
I'll just briefly add to what Alia has said. I think I very much agree with the point that the protest did offer scope for political demonstration for women's rights, and also for debate on women's rights issues, which has been important, and that we have to find a way to sustain that. I think as well, there have been some developments in terms of like victories of independence in student elections at university. There was Malham Khalaf won the Lebanese Bar Association election, and I think these shifts are ones that I think are ones we really need to build upon, that women can play an active role in, and that we really need to sort of seize upon as developing, power structures that can be infused with a more sort of women's rights centric approach. So women's participation, but also, a prioritization of women's issues.
Thank you so much. Our next question is from Sarah, who is one of our star PhD students here at Deakin.
Thank you everyone. Thank you, Dara, and the panelists for an amazing evening and an amazing discussion that's much needed, but depressive, to be honest, listening to all these accounts and the amount of work that is ahead of us, and to provide a better voice for women all around the Middle East. My question actually is more of a reflection on something that I saw on the Egyptian mainstream TV when it was the uprising in Egypt a long time ago, and that was the way by which they've used women, the bodies of women who were there at Al Tahrir Square in a sexual manner. The way by which they've referred to women who chose to participate in these demonstrations at that time was solely seemed to be in the manner and the fashion of highlighting that these women were out for sex, and it was disgusting listening to that kind of coverage in terms of the fact that they built tents and they were out to have a good time with men, and they tried to show evidence of all sorts of sexual objects that were left in Al Tahrir Square just to highlight that women were there to have sex. I want to hear, what do you think on that matter? Because women as sexual objects have always been on the table in all disciplines, and now as advocates we still see that happening and utilized to control the presence and the representation of women's advocacy in political spaces through referencing to them being sexual objects and all that, and the impact of that kind of presentation and representation in mainstream television on discouraging other women from going out to the streets and in the fear of being referred to in the manner that others have been highlighted. Interested to see what you think of that. and how can we face it? You know, how do we respond to it if mainstream media, you know, picture them in that manner? What is the counter voice? Where does it come from? And thank you.
I can just respond briefly. I mean, I think the tactic of blaming women for sexual assault, unfortunately, is not a new one. And it is one that we always have to fight very forcefully against. I think in the context of the Tahrir protest as well, it was used actively as a way to not just sort of absolve men that were responsible for those crimes of their responsibility, but to just, you know, as you're saying, Sada, to make people fearful from coming out and to discredit protesters and what protesters were doing in the square. So the strategy had, I think, multiple objectives, and that we really need to push back forcefully against the narrative. And I think we do that with facts. And to the extent that, you know, women are able to speak out when they suffer from these abuses, when they witness these abuses, and really set the record straight. It's really an essential part of the solution. I think part of it is also legislative and ensuring that, you know, the laws are in place that affect, you know, adequately criminalize this behavior. And then, of course, there's the issue of enforcement. You know, that when there is evidence of crimes, sexual crimes, assaults, that law enforcement responds appropriately. And these are all things that we're missing in the Egypt context.
Did you want to add to that, Asma or Alia?
I'm sorry, I had a power cut, so I missed the last few minutes. So I don't want to divert the conversation.
That's completely fine. Asma, did you want to add to that, or are you okay?
I think Lama has well spoken on it.
That she has. Our next question is from Nadine, who is another brilliant PhD student based at the University of Canberra.
Thank you, Dara. Just like Sarah, Lama's review of the 10 years actually got me thinking about Egypt and, you know, the sexualization of women's bodies, but in a different angle. So thinking about the punitive measures that were taken systematically and on a mass level in terms of conducting virginity tests in order to attest that these are, you know, like to demoralize the women participating and organize sexual assault as well. This very idea and very cruel demonstration of power that women should not be out. And if we could violate women in this way, we pretty much have the, you know, the power to violate anyone any way we see. And that's why, you know, Egypt was such a bloody scene, but it was contained compared to what happened in Syria and Yemen later on. So my question for the panel is, if you think that there were some gender-based violence forms of intimidation or targeting that are unique to post-2011, the 2011 political landscape, and if so, how do you think this affects women's participation?
Did anyone have any thoughts on that question?
I can go if that's all right. Yes, there's been I mean, there's always been a backlash when a woman takes a space she's not meant to do in the region, on whether it's in a personal level or more local or national. But after 2011, I think, and the years, 10 years later, I see there's also men who see themselves as disfranchised. So speaking of, I'll give an example when it comes to the development agenda, right? So there's been a lot on supporting the economy by supporting female entrepreneurs, by supporting women who are working, starting up businesses, etc. And that's extremely well, but that also meant that capacity building focused more on women and made employers more they want to employ more women than men in the workforce. not, of course, in managerial position, etc., but that meant that jobs were preferably given to women because of their experience and because the agencies and international organizations would support their businesses, etc. That has, I see, created the sense that some young men now are talking about how women are taking on the jobs, women are how women are well, benefiting more from all these development projects, etc. And that creates a certain different kind of tension, which of course is reflected in domestic violence, right? It's economic stress is a key factor for domestic violence and a backlash against women in the homeland. And that's the first backlash. I mean, when you look at assassinations of politicians or female activists, that's usually a very big structural sign that the system does not want you in there. But when it happens on a daily basis at home, where women are violated because they are taking their, well, they're becoming their own responsible individual human beings. So I see the violence actually not just in, I see violence, well, sorry, I think I derailed there, but I think I see the violence more has increased domestically than it has on the street.
Maybe just to complement what Asma has said, I think when, I mean, in the Syrian context, women did begin to play new roles in the family and in society as a result of the conflict. And those roles sometimes brought additional exposure to risk. And as a result of that, you know, we did see greater incidents of things like sexual violence, but certainly like detentions of women. Not things that were not happening before, but that began happening in greater frequency. And then, of course, the type of violence that they were subjected to in the context of the conflict was new, in the sense that, you know, before they weren't subject to indiscriminate bombing or, you know, deliberate attacks and things of that nature. And maybe I'll just say a little bit more about, you know, life for women living in areas under sort of violent extremist groups. And there as well, I mean, we saw very extreme restrictions in terms of movement, access to education, ability to be employed, you know, restrictions on communications, violence, threats of violence, being forced into marriage, you know, again, not abuses that are new per se, but like certainly were happening at a different scale and in a more pervasive way than we had been seeing before the conflict.
Did you want to add to that, Alia?
I think very quickly, I'll add to what Asma was saying. I think this, first 2 points I want to make. The violence that was used before, and that was, for example, Nadine mentioned the virginity test. These were things that were already happening in Egyptian arrests. And let's say that using sexual measures also against men and women was happening as a tool of oppression. It increased a lot during the early days of the revolution, and using these kind of tools, even gang rapes. I remember at the early days after 2011, even if somebody was raped, the conversation wouldn't even be opened because there was like this not wanting to admit that rape was happening. And then we've moved forward to admitting that rape was being used as a tool of war. And we've moved forward, I think, throughout the years where this built up of women gaining their own independence. I'm just trying to relook at the image, not to justify what has happened, but for many men, they were not used to the idea of dealing with a woman who has her own independence and her own rights. And we've seen that a lot with the refugees who left to Europe, for example, and how much clashes this created within the families. It's ongoing, and I expect we are going to have this transition to accepting that women are actually equal to men in the society, and that this means they are an equal partner at the level of the economy, at the level like what Asma very well described as this tension coming from the fact that women are taking our place. It shouldn't have been your place to begin with. It should be like 50% of the society is women. They need to be contributing to the economy just as much as you do. But we have to admit that the culture was there. The space was for men, and for many men who want out in the protest, they did not see this coming. They saw that they want something good for themselves, not also lose their space inside their household. This was a big reality they had to deal with. And again, here, it takes time. Some people adapted and accepted and were open about it, but we've seen it even, I mean, I remember at the early days, even at the level of protesters and rebels who are like very much pro-rights and everything. We've seen cases of domestic violence. Even the definition of domestic violence was very fluid. Like, this is not domestic violence. I think we've come forward, but we've really like the forms of violence are taking different forms. And yes, much of it has to do at the level of it's come to the very personal space where much of the education needs to be happening there. And this is where the real change starts. And it starts, I have to say, for both men and women, because a lot of the gatekeepers are actually women and part of the problem.
Thank you. Our next question was from Wissam.
Yes, hi everyone. Can you hear me, guys? Right? Yes, fantastic. So first of all, thanks for the panel. Thanks for everyone. America, Dara, thank you very much for everything. First of all, I wanna thank Lama and Asma as well, Alia, because these guys are very reliable. They had like a daily contact with the people on the land. That's the thing that makes people like reliable in order to give some information, like a personal experience. This is something very important, especially in this very interesting discussion. What I wanna add on yes, right now we've been discussing the women's right issues in the Middle East before and after 2011, which is we've seen some tangible achievements before the uprising of the Arab Spring, and afterwards we had the same. We had some things. Of course, the biggest obstacle was the uprising of the Arab Spring, of course. My question here is, what kind of future that you've been drawing, you've been expecting before 2011, and what kind of future right now for the women's right in the Middle East after that? My second question, actually, I just want to ask, go through it like very, very quickly, just to make extra, if I may. Now, I used to work with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon. And yes, we've been talking about women in, like Alia said, she had a contact with women during the conflict in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, as well as Lama, of course. I personally had an experience with the Human Rights Watch by visiting like a delegation visit one of the biggest refugee camps in Jordan, which is Zaatari camp at that time, and we've been interviewing one of the women at risk at that time. She was from Syria, but originally also from Chechnya, which is also like a ethnic minority, just like America highlighted at the beginning. And the head of the delegation of the Human Rights Watch was from Senegal. So my next question was her question. She had problems. She was telling all the stories about what happened in Syria, what happened when she went to Lebanon, what kind of persecution she experienced in these two countries, and how eventually they they concluded to resettle her in Jordan. So the question was, she had like a little kid on her, like a very, like around 2 or 3 years old kid. So the head of the delegation of Human Rights Watch asked me after the whole interview finished, she said, now this kid, after a while, when he grows and becomes, finishes like the university, and afterwards he become a decision maker in some country, what do you think the first decision he's going to make? So basically, this is the question right now. Yes, we've been discussing women in Syria, women in these, but there is also another category, like the refugees in these people, and what kind of persecution, what kind of problems that they have to do, they were experiencing that. For instance, in Jordan, in 2015, was 78% of the refugees in total Jordan, from Iraq, Syria, Palestine, from all the places, were women. We understand that there is also like a lot of international communities, international entities, NGOs, Human Rights Watch, UN Women, a lot of agencies that are trying to push the wheel forward, of course. But what kind of future that you've been seeing, like especially like after discussing all these contradictions, after seeing all these obstacles around? Thank you.
First, thank you for your question, Wissam, because you know, one of the things that is the most important to me is the fact that in 2011 I've been to all these places myself. I've seen Libya, I've seen Yemen, I've seen Syria, and the realities I've learned from the ground, and the reality I know about the people in these places before it got so messed up is something that I witnessed firsthand, and I know no matter what happened later, all these people wanted was a better life. This is what they still want. How things are, what kind of reality at the time, I am one of the people who naively believed that the revolutions had a chance to win, that the transfer of power could actually happen, and it came from what I saw on the street. It came from, it came from the fact that it had started to happen in Tunisia. Egypt gave us a huge push. Then things got where we saw them to see. I still believe today that it's going to take longer, but it's not. History does not go back. It's violent and it's heartbreaking day in, day out, yes, but there is no turning back. I don't think these regimes can ever govern again. They cannot go back to pre-2011. This can go on for 100 years, but there's no going back to pre, for the simple reason most people have already lost what they had to live with initially without doing anything. To answer your question, the big loss really, what cannot be recuperated is education. You were asking about what's going to happen to all these people. We have a generation of people who did not go to school and who had to grow up, whether in refugee camps, and in some cases even worse, in pre-Daesh areas, and afterwards in all kind of oppressive refugee camps, and they're not educated, and we're talking about millions of people. This is a generation lost, and there is no getting out of this reality, because you cannot, this is 10 years, this is those are lives that is going to be very, very difficult to actually, you might succeed with some, but the big numbers are always going to be there, and this is a very worrying also reality. Most of the refugees are in places where this is with time, with every month, they're becoming on top of being discriminated against, on top of being abused, on top of anything, the future doesn't look any better for any of them, and for even for the hosting countries as well, or even for Syria itself. So, but does that mean you go back to saying maybe it was not worth it? It was unavoidable. It had to happen, because what was the reality at the time was just it looked more stable, but it wasn't really. The components of all the violence that we are seeing were always there.
I'll just add to what Alia said. I mean, I think sometimes when we think about progress, we think about it in a linear way, and it's really not how progress happens. And I think that's the experience of the past 10 years. You know, there has been some gains, but there have been significant losses. And if we look at the role that women have played in the context of the Syrian uprising or in Yemen and in these uprisings and the conflicts in the region, I think that there is additional space that has been created there in terms of societal shifts and understandings based on the roles that women have had to occupy as a result of what has happened, the political violence, as well as the wars that followed it. This is something that we can build on. I think there needs to continue to be a concerted effort to support women that are playing these roles, that are leading initiatives to create more rights-respecting spaces within their own communities. I share Alia's concern around the destabilizing refugee situation, particularly when it comes to absence of access to quality education and the ability for children that are born into these settings to really have, you know, fulfilled lives. And it is something that it is a failure of, you know, regional states, international community, and I think a lot of blame can land on the shoulders of the host countries, but the burden was never one that could be absorbed by one host country. We really needed to have a much more robust international cooperation and a sense of responsibility, which was lacking and continues to lack. And I think you don't see the adequate support or the adequate pressure on local countries to avoid what is going to be a growing problem of disenfranchised, unsupported populations that are not in a position to hope better for themselves or for their families. And that should be something that gives us all concern.
Did you want to add to that, Asma?
No, I think both Alia and Lama have spoken well.
They did, didn't they? So I think we've run out of questions now. So, and it's getting quite late here in Australia. So I might take this, these fascinating last answers, which I think really speak to not only the challenges of the last 10 years, but the challenges of the next 10 years, you know, and leave us at a really good point. So, I mean, thank you so much to our speakers. It's been a truly phenomenal panel. It has just been a delight to chair and to hear about your experiences and what you've observed over the years. And I think it just speaks volumes that despite so many awful things that have happened, that you've been able to speak for 2 hours also about the huge progress that has been made and the enormous achievements that women have made despite everything. And it's been inspiring to hear your hope for a better tomorrow. So thank you to the three of you for participating. We really appreciate it. Thank you to the rest of you, our audience, as always, for your thoughtful and nuanced questions. We wouldn't do this without you, and you're all fantastic. Thank you to DFAT's Council for Australian Arab Relations for their generous support of this initiative and of women in leadership programs in Australia and across the Middle East, which are so incredibly important. And finally, I'd just like to reiterate our respects and condolences to the family and friends of Luqman Sling and Lebanon more broadly. May he rest in power. Thank you all so much and good night.